I think I stepped into a parallel universe for a moment. This happened when I was around 18 or 19, but I remember it vividly because of how jarring and confusing it was. I've had a few odd experiences with dreams, but nothing in the middle of the day like this. So, when this happened, I was still living at home with my parents, and we lived in my childhood home. This home was pretty much all I ever knew, as we moved there when I was 3 years old. I had a habit of going on daily walks in the nearby park, something I did nearly every single day since I was 14 or 15 years of age, up until I moved out. It was the summer, around 1 or 2 p.m., and I went to leave the house for one of my walks. I slipped my shoes on and went to open the door as usual, but when I stepped out of the house and looked up, my neighborhood felt completely wrong. It didn't look any different. Everything looked exactly the same as it usually did. The small ravine next to our house, the tree in the front yard, the steep driveway, and our neighbors' houses, all of it looked completely normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something really wrong and different with it all. It felt as if reality was warped or something. I stood on the front porch for a minute or so trying to figure out what felt so incredibly wrong with my neighborhood. After a while, though, I figured I was just being silly and I made my way down the driveway. When I was about halfway down, my neighbor, who was tending to his garden across the street, looked up towards me, stared at me as if he saw a ghost, his face going completely pale, and he opened his mouth to speak. Before I could even stare at him in confusion, before he had gotten a single word out, I was back inside my house, at my front door, about to leave. I was completely shaken. I had no idea how I had ended up back in my front door. I had no idea what I just experienced, and when I pulled the door open, it was completely normal. Nothing felt wrong anymore. It was all glaringly normal. The only difference was when I opened my door again, my neighbor was not out front gardening. I had decided not to go out for a walk that day. Years later, I have no idea what I experienced, and as weird as it sounds, the part that freaks me out the most is how wrong my neighborhood felt despite looking exactly the same. So, between the weird teleportation back indoors and my neighbor acting as if he was staring at a ghost, the feeling of wrongness is the thing that bothers me the most. I don't know how to explain it. I didn't feel unsafe. It didn't feel like dread. It just felt like I was looking at a completely different version of my neighborhood at that moment, and I don't think I will ever forget it. I've never really told anyone about this, as I'm usually a pretty skeptical person, but I have no way to explain this. It's possible that in another universe you have passed away, and your neighbor was therefore terrified to see you standing about in front of him. In that universe, he's probably going on the Reddit paranormal sub to talk about how he saw his dead neighbor casually walking out and about while he was gardening. The creepiest part is how you felt something was off, though everything looked the same. I think you did subconsciously notice differences, and that gave you a gut feeling. Anyway, thanks for sharing this. I wish you'd check with your neighbor and see if he had anything to say to you. I wish I had time back then when it happened. I often thought about asking him if I did something weird that day or if he had an odd experience with me, but unfortunately he died last week, of course, so I never got the chance to. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons, even death may die. Someone brought up the concept of jamais vu, which is similar to déjà vu. Déjà vu meaning something that you've already seen before, or at least something that you think you've already seen before, and jamais vu being the opposite, which would be what happened in this scenario, where they went outside and everything seemed familiar but wasn't quite right, almost as if there was something outside that they had never seen before. That's been my thought for a long time. What if places that people think are haunted are actually just weaknesses in the space-time continuum, and we're really just seeing glimpses into another moment in time, and they, in turn, are seeing us? For example, if we're seeing a ghost from the past, and that person in the past is seeing a ghost from the future, or even their past, this would give rise to stories being told for many years, decades, and centuries that a location is haunted. There's something called derealization, which is when the brain suddenly processes your surroundings differently. It can be a short-term thing or last for months. If you're on any new medications or had an emotional trigger at that moment, it could have caused that to happen. As for your neighbor, maybe they were just reacting to your facial expressions at that moment when you were feeling that things just weren't right. I can see the argument for this being an account of derealization here, except for the fact that in order for this to completely be derealization, they would have had to dream up going all the way outside and then appearing back indoors, which is a little bit of a stronger leap than just, seeing something out of the corner of your eye. Ultimately, there's no way of really knowing what this person actually went through without feeling it for ourselves, but in this case, I keep going back between this as one of those moments where your brain just short circuits for a second and some physical or metaphysical phenomena that so many people in the following accounts have actually experienced. I think that's actually pretty spot on. Once while volunteering giving tours at a haunted location, a bunch of us workers stayed late to do an overnight investigation. We were all sitting in a room together, half goofing off, half investigating, when we heard a voice, clear as day, echo through the large hallway right outside the doorway. A young woman's voice with a modern inflection, shakily but loudly asked, "Is anyone here?" We went silent for a moment and then scrambled and searched the building. We were on the third floor of an empty, secure, privately owned building on decent land. We found no one. No cars came and went. What shook us the most was the way she said it. It sounded exactly like something we would say during an investigation if we suddenly heard noise, which we were making. It sparked a long conversation where we all discussed the possibility of thin spots between dimensions and maybe that building being on one. And maybe all of our investigating was just us running into investigators one dimension over. The building was said to be haunted its entire existence, so that theory could be said for the 100+ years it was in use. The hundreds of experiences documented over the years could just be two realities sitting a little too close to one another and scaring its respective residents in similar ways. This last January, I was walking around and decided to hike up the top of a small mound, which is known to have some burials on top covered with rocks. I got up the top and there was a no trespassing sign for the burial area, which I respected. I just sat and admired the view for a while, then came down the path going down the side of the mound. As I was coming down, which is about a 5 to 10 minute walk, I saw a woman of around 60 years old at the bottom. She passed in front of the trailhead, headed to my right, and then went back left again. Then she did it again for a second time. She was wearing a woman's polyester blend off-white tank top. Her hair was in a bob to her shoulders. She was short and pleasantly plump. What the hell is this? She looked Caucasian and had salt and pepper hair. She looked completely normal and modern, but the weird thing was she never looked up at me on the trail, which was strange because I was right there and I was making a noise with my shoes and my hiking stick. She just passed in front, back and forth 2 times and was looking around as if she was confused or looking for something. She made me kind of uneasy, and I thought she probably had a problem with me going on top of the mound because of the burials, or wanted to make sure I wasn't a vandal or whatever. I stopped on the trail to let her clear out so I wouldn't have to talk to her or be yelled at. So I stopped and gazed out over the area for about 20 seconds and then started back down. And that's when she did it again. For the 3rd time, she emerged and passed in front of the trailhead, going to my right, then back left again. I thought, okay, I'll just see what her deal is when I get down to the bottom. I got to the bottom about a minute later, and to my shock, there was no one there. I thought she must have headed down the trail that hugs the base of the mound, so I ran ahead to see the curvature of the trail, and there was no one on the trail or anywhere in the whole vicinity. It's a dry, deserty landscape, and I could see the panorama of the whole area. It really left me scratching my head. A couple weeks later, I was Googling and saw something about moon phases being connected to the paranormal, so I Googled and found out that it was indeed a full moon on this day. This happened January 17th, and the moon also reached fullness at the exact time of day that I was out there and saw this woman. It was really odd. I would love to know who she is/was. Anyway, it may be good to look into moon phases when y'all have unusual experiences. Users then asked them if they had been back to that trailhead in particular, and they had, but there's been no other occurrences since then. I think I've scared myself once, as crazy as it sounds. I was a teen standing in my bedroom, and when I hear the distinct patterned squeak of the stairs like someone was coming up them quickly, I turned towards the open door and didn't see anything, but felt a burst of human energy turn the corner into my room quickly and then stop. Really scared me because I was home alone and the stairs were wooden and only squeaked like that when you came up them. A couple of years later, I wasn't home alone, but I was about to leave and had rushed upstairs to grab something I had forgotten. The stairs did their usual squeak, and as I turned around the corner quickly into my room, I felt the energy of someone standing in the middle of the room facing the door and being scared like they hadn't expected me to come back. I was also scared for a couple of seconds before I realized the room didn't feel like a different energy. It felt normal, and I remembered that previous incident. It was strange, but it got me thinking differently about haunting and the unexplained for sure. I've had vaguely similar experiences, but it occurred during a projection-type sleep paralysis session. I found myself floating above a forest watching a group of hunters below. I flew down over them and saw that one of them was lying in the moss having a rest. I hovered above him thinking I was simply an invisible observer in the dreamscape. Then he suddenly locked eyes with me and his expression changed into one of absolute dread. Like you said, it's as if he'd seen a ghost. The shock of being spotted, as well as the feeling of having scared someone that badly, jolted me awake, or so I thought. As I got up, I stepped out of my own body. Being an idiot, I got excited out of my mind and ran into my apartment building's stairwell looking for some tiny detail to bring back with me to the waking world as proof that I wasn't just dreaming. I settled for a tiny ink mark on the wall. As I woke up, for real this time, I ran out once more to see the ink, only to realize that the wall I'd looked at didn't even exist in the stairwell. What the fuck? I've had a similar, less intense experience as you. I was going for a walk around my neighborhood, and as soon as I turned around the block, I had to stop in my tracks because everything just felt wrong. It's exactly how you describe it. Everything looked the same as far as I could tell, but I had the distinct, jarring feeling that I was not in the same place. I always listen to my own Spotify playlists when I walk, and as I continued walking down the street, two songs played in a row that I didn't recognize. As in, never heard them before in my life, never seen the album art or title or singer before, on my own playlist. It was in the middle of the playlist too, so it wasn't just Spotify adding random similar songs at the end like it sometimes does. When I got home, I checked my playlist and I couldn't find those two songs. Everything felt back to normal by then, too. Interestingly, while they didn't remember what the songs exactly were, they said that they were sort of retro indie in genre, which seems pretty fitting for the soundtrack to an alternate universe. I had an experience that I'd like to share. This happened 1 year ago. I live in a small village outside of New York City. It's not a very diverse village, very homogeneous. Most people, 95% of people here, are white. I go to the only cafe on Main Street several times a week, and I know the staff there. All young, local white kids working behind the counter, serving coffee and baked goods. One night, I walk inside the cafe and notice the kids behind the counter. All of them are Asian. I think that's pretty odd, and I can't make sense of it. The entire staff changed overnight? Perplexed, I order my coffee. A little old Asian woman comes out from the kitchen carrying a buspan to gather the dirty plates. I ask her if there were new owners of the business. The lady says, no new owner. This makes absolutely no sense to me. I get my coffee and leave the cafe. I go a couple doors down where a friend of mine owns a clothing store. I tell my friend how strange it was that the entire staff was replaced with an Asian staff, and it was just peculiar. He shrugs his shoulders and doesn't think much of it. A couple of nights later, I go back to the cafe. The staff has now reverted back to all the kids I recognized from before. The owner was also there. I approached the owner. I said it was so funny. I came the other night and the whole staff had been replaced with Asian kids. He looks at me sideways and says, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, a couple nights ago when I came in, none of your staff was here, just a new staff of young Asian kids. He said there's never been an Asian person working here. I said, what about the old woman I spoke with? He hesitates for a second and then states that there's no old lady that works at the cafe. I was so confused. This was very disconcerting. I went a couple of doors down and spoke with my friend to remind him of our conversation, and he says, I don't know what you're talking about. We never had any such conversation. I went back another time to talk to the staff independently to see if there was any story that I wasn't aware of. Nope. Now they all think I am either lying, on drugs, or totally psychotic. I assure you that I am neither of those things, but perhaps I did slip into a parallel universe. It's still very, very, very hard for me to accept and believe, but it happened. I had a similar experience when I was in college, but a little more involved. Never been able to explain it. And that's where he left it out. What a useless comment. You know, I believe you. When my mother was a teenager, her and a group of friends decided to take a slightly different route home one day by walking down a ravine-type area. The group suddenly, all together, started feeling that something was off, and when they decided to turn back, the buildings were gone. In fear, they continued to walk ahead and came across a group of folks dressed in what seemed to be centuries-old garments. This group also noticed my mom and her friends and appeared surprised/scared to see them. My mom explains that an older woman from the group gestured at them to turn back, and when they did, the buildings were there again. She told me that she had never run as fast in her life as she did that day. Her and her friends ended up catching a bus back home and were silent the entire ride. She tells me that they were in so much shock they were silent the entire way home. I've asked her to look for her friends via social media as they've lost touch and it's been decades since they've spoken, but she would rather not. I'd be interested to hear what happened from one of her other friends. I have a theory. What if our dreams are visions of our consciousness in another universe? There's a parallel you sharing your consciousness in that other universe. I can personally say that when I was little, around 4 or 5, I remember 100% to this day how I would always hear someone calling my name around sunset, and I would always turn to see who it was, and there was nothing. Just the pretty, orangey, pinkish night sky. And I would always say to myself that my current life was a dream, and that I would wake up from it. I'd proceed to pinch myself to make sure I'd wake up. How would I feel and think that way in such a young age? I've been delivering packages for 2 years now in Jacksonville, Florida. For the past 2 years, I've had the same route, but at the beginning of the year, it changed. Today, my last stop was the same house that I've delivered to before, but when I made the turn, it was a dirt road with a few homes. I reached the house that I'm delivering to, and it's the same house that I've delivered to before, except, I think that one sucks. All I could say is if I was outside gardening, and I looked up and saw someone across the street start to dematerialize before my eyes, I'd go pale. My jaw would drop, and I definitely wouldn't be outside gardening anymore. This was Dante Calvino. Let me know what you thought of the format for these stories, or if you have one of your own to tell. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more mystery every week.